Welcome to the edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C., and it's already our last program of the old year, recording here in Washington on the afternoon of December 3rd, 2016. By the time you hear this, it will be New Year's Eve at the earliest, and that will be December 31st. So the old year passing away, 2016, a year of shocks and reverses, I would say, but still the future does open up ahead of us, and optimism is always the keynote on a program like this. And I want to remind people, don't be depressed. This Friday, December 30th, is the 6th day of Christmas. So instead of having Christmas already completely gone, it's the 6th day. So you've only come halfway through the Christmas season. And by Saturday, it's going to be the 7th day of Christmas. That's Saturday, December 31st, Saint Sylvester. And then, of course, Sunday, January 1st. Now, a promising sign in the world, certainly. A positive sign, a promising sign. We support it. We want it. There are problems, but nevertheless, the Syrian ceasefire is a major step for the world. And quite frankly, which diplomatic sensibilities, which egos, which amour propre gets bruised in the process, we really don't care too much about that, right? The important thing is that this colossal bloodletting in Syria should cease. And apparently it is ceasing. That is to say, the ceasefire, by all accounts that I can find, is holding more or less. That is to say, on Friday night in Syria, after the midnight ceasefire beginning, there are no civilian casualties reported, none reported. So no civilian casualties, at least none reported, and the shooting has died down a lot. Now, we are told, just to get this out of the way, that there has been artillery fire heard in an area near Damascus, which actually happens to be the source of about 3/4 of the water supply for the large metropolis of Damascus. So that water provision apparatus, right, whatever it is, dams, pumping stations, that has been maybe not hit, but bombs and shells have gone off near there and may have hit it. So we're sure about that. That's worth being worried about. But still, other than that, that seems to the worst of it. So once again, it's a Syrian ceasefire. It is sponsored by Russia, of course, representing the Assad government, and Turkey supporting the various, 300 to 350 groups. Now, a lot of those are tiny splinter factions. So there are 7 major groups that Russia and Turkey say are taking part in this. They say that 62,000 fighters have been convinced to stop shooting for the moment. It's a truce. It's a ceasefire in place. And the word is that terrorists, of course, the terrorist groups ISIS and Nusra are not eligible to be covered by it. And we're also told that these other forces, if they don't join it, then they're going to become targets. So if you don't adhere to the truce and support it, if you don't stop shooting, then you may be declared a terrorist. Now, one of the big questions revolves around who's taking part. There are two that we need to look at. One is Ahrar al-Sham. Ahrar al-Sham is one of the larger ones. They are a former component, I believe, of the Islamic Front, and they say they are not taking part. So that's the Ahrar al-Sham saying, no, not us, but of course this is all fluid. It changes. You've also got the other one to watch, of course, is the Nusra brigades. Now, they are excluded by the terms of this ceasefire. They call themselves Jabhat Fatah al-Sham. Sham is the term for Damascus and Syria in general. So Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, their status is going to be, I think, a very important one to watch. In the course of this, there have been asides, remarks by Lavrov. One of them is Lavrov saying, the U.S. is always trying to protect Nusra, in effect, whatever they call themselves now. So Lavrov says that, and I think, well, we have to take that quite seriously. And, of course, that's astounding because this is al-Qaeda. The U.S. defending al-Qaeda against Russia and others. That's the general Russian foreign ministry line. The U.S. is addicted to protecting, defending, screening al-Qaeda. Now, one group which is apparently not included, and this is, I think, the big problem with this truce, it is the Kurds, and in particular, it is the YPG Kurds. And these are the ones, of course, that have done such valiant service in fighting ISIS. They're the ones who have closed most of the Turkish to Syrian border, right? This is their state, I guess we can call it, of Rojava. And Rojava is what has taken over the border area south of the border with Turkey and prevented ISIS and other terrorists from sending stuff across. And there's been a kind of a coalition between the U.S. and the YPG Kurds. Now, you can see that what Turkey is aiming at here is Turkey is apparently willing to jettison a number of its groups that it had been protecting, right? We're talking about ISIS to a large extent. We're talking about Nusra and many of the others. But for Turkey, the big issue, of course, is this fundamentally demagogic thesis, right? Erroneous, whatever you want to call it, not true, that the YPG Kurds are terrorists. That is ISIS, that they're the same as the worst terrorists. That is simply not true. But you can see what Turkey is trying to do with this entire maneuver is to somehow codify that the Kurds are not included. There's no seat at the table for them. No seat at the table for the Kurds and no seat at the table for the U.S. Now, is that tenable? I think one of the Turkish diplomats has said that there will be a peace conference in Astana and that the United States would be welcome at that peace conference. Now, whether this is before the 20th of January or not, we're going to look into in just a minute here on World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. It's the end of the old year, our last program in 2016. Happy New Year to all, and we're hoping for positive outcomes in 2017. We will have analysis about this both on this program and, of course, on the other program. The other program is daily, Monday through Thursday. It is The American System. And the American System keeps you updated every day of the week for a good hour of commentary, news, historical background, and other stuff. And if you want to support my work, then the best way to do it is to become a subscriber to the American system. Now, during the program today, we're going to be checking the news reports coming from the Middle East. CNN 1 hour ago says that sporadic clashes only have marred the ceasefire brokered by Russia and Turkey. Another report, clashes reported in Syrian city despite ceasefire. And, of course, Slate magazine blog stresses that it's a fragile ceasefire, and fragile is what Putin called it. And we've got all kinds of people talking about waning U.S. influence and the Russian ascendancy. Well, maybe that's somewhat overstated. Now, there is a resolution being submitted by Russia to the United Nations Security Council, and that is an endorsement of support of the Syrian ceasefire, which has now gone through. The U.S. should obviously vote for that. And again, it's time to cut the losses for the U.S. Dump these crazy terrorist rebels. You cannot appear in public supporting Al-Qaeda and hope that that's going to have a good outcome. How should that work? This is what I would say to Kerry, the State Department, and the rest of them. You just have to find other partners, other allies. The Kurds are a good start, but why not bite the bullet and start working together with Assad? He's going to be very welcoming, because that will then give him new options that he doesn't have now, right? He doesn't necessarily want to be the client of only one country, Russia. I'm sure he'd like to have the U.S. to turn to on certain issues. So why are we tied to the carcass of these terrorist rebels who are going down? According to certain groups of rebels quoted by Reuters yesterday, they say the Nusra Front is included. And, well, we don't know. The State Department here in Washington has said that the ceasefire is a positive thing. Well, good. So get out there and work for it. The immediate measure that I would recommend is, you remember when Kerry went to Moscow, I guess it must have been at the end of October, he was carrying this plan, which was leaked to the Washington Post, which we covered here in, I think, significant detail. There's supposed to be a joint coordination center. Some journalistic accounts now call it a control room, a joint control room. Well, fine. A joint control room. You can call it a filter room, right? Like with the Dowding system of the Royal Air Force back during the Battle of Britain, except this would be the desire of Russia and the United States to clobber terrorist groups as they were found. And that was the thing that went by the boards when the U.S. bombed the Auld facility of the Syrian army, letting ISIS back in. That was crazy. And then this mysterious or never satisfactorily explained attack on the column of aid vehicles, trucks, principally trucks, 18-wheelers that were bringing in the humanitarian goods. And remember that the story coming from the U.S. was that those were bombed from the air. They were not bombed from the air, and you could see it. There were no bomb craters. This was strictly bazookas, rockets, RPGs, small arms, and things like this. So the Joint Coordination Center should now be set up in Jordan, and that will then allow the U.S. to cooperate with Russia in what we hope would be the final phase. Now that a number of these groups have decided to cool it, that leaves ISIS and that leaves Nusra, and it's time to take care of them. So rather than crying over the failure of the terrorist rebels, many of them foreigners, right? Foreign fighters, Those are the ones shipped in by Saudi Arabia and Turkey. Don't be tied to them. Don't be bitter. Don't feel left out. Right? Don't pout. It's time to get busy and to try to think about the future and the reconstruction of Syria and a whole series of other related problems. So this I think is the way to go. So what else do we have here? Again, you have to look at Erdogan, right? Erdogan has three axes to grind, not just the Kurds. Erdogan of Turkey is concerned to try to get the Kurds classified as terrorists or somehow cut out of it. And he has, to some degree, according to some, he has succeeded in getting perhaps a hint of support from Putin. Some journalistic accounts say Putin's remark that it's important to preserve the territorial integrity of Syria. Some would say this is a way of saying that the Kurds should not be given their state of Rojava, the Western Kurdish entity, right? A lot of it along the Turkish-Syrian border. So that Turkey is trying to block that from coming about. Erdogan is also angry about that coup that almost overthrew him in July 15th of this past year. That was a close thing. Could have worked, but it didn't. And then, of course, this Gulen story, the spiritual leader or political leader of certain anti-Erdogan forces in Turkey who is ensconced in the state of Pennsylvania here in the U.S., and they're demanding his extradition. The problem is that they don't present evidence, and we as you see in the broadcast today, we're going to be asking for evidence. So we're not going to be swallowing things without evidence, and that goes for Erdogan as well as for anyone else. So we'll be back in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. Now, we're going to go on to the lurid chronicles of Grizzly Steppe. Grizzly Steppe is coming up next. But before we get to Grizzly Steppe, let's look on the lighter side of things. Hey, tomorrow is New Year's Eve. By the time you're hearing this, if you're hearing it on the first day it's available, it's going to be New Year's Eve. So what are you going to be doing? You're going to be celebrating, and you're going to be paying homage to one of the positive figures that does not get enough attention in literature classes, and that is Robert Burns. Robert Burns, the Scottish poet, the Bard of Ayrshire, the ploughman poet, who is actually one of the best figures in the English-speaking literature of the 18th century, 1759 to 1796. National poet of Scotland, famous. He could write in straight Scottish. He could write in a kind of a Scottish-English melange, or he could write in English and extremely well in all three. So we're going to be singing his poem, Auld Lang Syne. Auld Lang Syne. Syne. Now, I'm told that the Scottish want you to say sign rather than Syne. Okay, Auld Lang Syne. What does this mean? It means long, long ago, old times, for the sake of old times, days gone by, times gone by. In other words, the past. And the idea of this, it's puzzling for people because there are some question marks that don't quite come across in the singing version of it, but is should old acquaintance be forgotten? In other words, it's a question, is it right to forget your old friends? Is it right to forget the memories of the past? Well, probably not, right? So you should remember them, and you should cherish the memories. So time's gone by, and it comes down to this idea that you want to remember. And again, we come down for historicity, right? We want to have the historical background, right? We do not want the radically anti-historical view, which is typical of the English-speaking world right about now, right? Leibniz had a term for it. He said, mens momentania carens recordationem. Watch out for the moment mind which has no memory. In other words, if some guy was telling you something yesterday and now he tells you something different, you've got the presence of mind to remember all that. But the problem for New Year's Eve is to know one of the problems, perhaps one of the lesser ones. Auld Lang Syne, time's gone by. So it's a recommendation from Robert Burns to remember the past and don't forget people. Right? Try to keep them in your purview. Now, just a couple of words about Robert Burns. This is, as I say, one of the best people in this second half of the 18th century in the English-speaking world. Totally, he's somebody who really stands out. And I can't really give you a whole sketch of his career, except I would just like to point to one poem which has to do with essentially some of the themes we've been discussing here during the holiday season. He has a poem called Holy Willie's Prayer. Holy Willie's Prayer. And this is a satire of Calvinism. And you have to know that the Church of Scotland, sometimes called the Presbyterian Church, but the Church of Scotland is Calvinist. It is based on the doctrines of John Calvin, the French lawyer who operated out of Geneva. And the Holy Willie's Prayer is a great satire of the ideas of total depravity and absolute predestination and the relegation of the human will to a non-existent position. So what Robert Burns is telling you is he wants a religion that can pass the test of reason, that's intelligible, and of course that preserves human freedom, free will, so that you can affect to some extent what happens to you in terms of salvation. So this is a great guy, and I can't devote much more time to it, but maybe in the future we'll get back to it. Maybe we'll read you parts of Holy Willie's Prayer, but it's also hilarious, right? So he's got a sense of humor. So that is the New Year's Eve story here on World Crisis Radio. Now we have to go on once again, the Lurid Chronicles, Grizzly Steppe. Now, what is Grizzly Steppe? Well, you might ask. This is now the so-called proof. This is what the U.S. government has put forward as proof that Russia is responsible for the hacks. And what is it? It's called a Joint Analysis Report. You can find this on the internet. Go and look at it. assets.documentcloud.org. Once again, assets.documentcloud.org. And at the top of this 13-page document, we see NCCIC. And NCCIC is a part of the Department of Homeland Security. So they are one agency backing this, and the other agency is the FBI. So they're telling you that Russia is responsible for this hacking. The NCCIC, National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center, NCCIC, National Cybersecurity and Communications Center, and then the FBI. So this is called Grizzly Steppe, a Joint Analysis Report, or JAR, and they want you to know that Russian intelligence services, both civilian and military, RIS, Russian intelligence services, have been carrying out malicious cyber activity against a U.S. political party, the Democratic Party, obviously, the Democratic National Committee, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, and they go back to the statement on October 7th, 2016, where the Department of Homeland Security and the Director of National Intelligence, Clapper, now outgoing, put forward this idea that Russia is doing these attacks. Now, they have some interesting charts. They distinguish adversary space, and over in the adversary space on the left, we see a muffled individual with a laptop computer, and those are Advanced Persistent Threat 29 and Advanced Persistent Threat 28. One, the KGB or FSB, the other, the GRU or military intelligence. And what happens then is they can establish communications with targeted systems and then exfiltrate data. And they also want to tell you what happened to John Podesta, who foolishly decided to get, he was gulled by somebody's spear phishing. We'll get back to this in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So we're going through the Grizzly Steppe, and we're sifting it, and we're evaluating. Is it proof? So far, it's not proof. It's interesting, but it's not proof. So let's just take a look at this now. From the adversary space, the U.S. government is now calling this whole thing Grizzly Steppe. In other words, the alleged Russian operation is called Grizzly Steppe. We find the Grizzly Steppe leverages an operational infrastructure, and they send emails with malicious links to the very respectable-looking guy in a suit who is supposedly Podesta. This character, foolishly duped, gulled, clicks on the link. This is spear phishing. And we're told that spear phishing is not just that they send you something where if you click on it, then you're going to be lost, right? Because they're gonna take over your computer. But in the case of spear phishing, it's something that's personalized to you. It says, "Dear Chairman Podesta," or "Dear John," or something like this, and it seems to be better quality, right? It might have letterheaded, but it's not some crude thing with lots of spelling mistakes. So anyway, Podesta apparently clicks on the link and enters credentials, right? He divulges all kinds of codes and numbers and so forth. That goes to a website that looks legitimate but is not. That gathers the credentials. It goes back to the Grizzly Steppe operational infrastructure. That then uses the credentials to access a targeted system, Democratic National Committee or Podesta's emails. That gathers data of interest, and that data of interest is then exfiltrated back to the operational infrastructure. And thence we assume to Guccifer, to DC Leaks, to WikiLeaks, to the rest of it. And they give you a list of Russian, what they call Russian military and civilian intelligence services, RIS, the alternate name. So there's APT-28, APT-29, just to give you a couple of samples of this. Cosmic Duke, Cozy Bear, Cozy Car, Cozy Duke, Fancy Bear, Cake Duke, Hammer Toss, Old Bait, Onion Duke, Sea Daddy, on and on. Tiny Baron, SAR Team, water bug, ex-agent, on and on. These are the various names that have popped up. Now, again, the rest of it, after the first few pages, it's not even attempting to build a case against Russia. It's rather instructions, useful hints, and so forth for people in the federal agencies to protect themselves, for the federal agencies to increase their resilience. But so far, there's no proof. So it is not proof. It's a description of an operation, but it doesn't have anything that could be described as proof. Now, the problem with this, of course, is what would be proof? What would proof be in terms of direct proof? Well, according to one expert, if you had a television feed, if you had a video looking over the shoulder of a Grizzly Steppe Russian hacker typing away, keyboarding away on a laptop, and if you could see on the screen that this was hacking in to Podesta's emails, then that might be proof. So that is, of course, extremely unlikely to occur. So therefore, you're left with, well, no proof, in effect, right? Not proof, but wondering what it might be. So I was one of these, another cyber expert pointed to a principle that I think is highly valid, that the fox is the finder. The fox is the finder, and this, of course, means that the agency that points first to this abuse, or that raises the alarm, sounds the alarm, or begins putting out danger signals, that they may be the perpetrator. And I think this deserves a moment of pause, right, before we go down the road of blaming Russia for this stuff, right? There are other accounts out there. The Russian media themselves, RT and so forth, are putting forward quotes from Assange, from a British diplomat, and from some others who say that it's not a hack, it's a leak, that the person who divulged, for example, the Podesta emails is someone who worked for the Democratic National Committee, somebody who was a Bernie Sanders supporter, who was disgruntled because of the unfair treatment of Bernie, and therefore decided to leak this stuff. Now, that may seem plausible, or maybe it's not so plausible. But anyway, it's a possible explanation. I would, however, look across the landscape and see what agencies actually have a track record of attempting to essentially damage, harm the Hillary Clinton campaign, and thus to try to help her adversary. And there's no doubt the one that stands out is the FBI. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and its director, James Comey, has the best documented track record of attempting to interfere in this election. And this is the two Comey letters, not one, but two. One saying, oh, I got a bunch of emails, and then 2 or 3 days before the election, another letter saying, oh, there are these emails, but there's nothing in them. That is, of course, an interference of the first magnitude. And then we have the story of the FBI field office in New York City, which talked about using Clinton cash as the basis not just of an investigation, but even of some say indictments of Mrs. Clinton and others. So I would recommend that rather than rush to judgment, it would be important to focus on the track record of different players in this complicated universe. Now, we're also told that every device, every computer, every laptop, desktop, every smartphone, anything and everything that gets on the internet has a MAC address. Now, this is not the Mac of Macintosh or Apple computer, but it's an acronym for something else. The MAC address is 12 digits, and it's called a hexadecimal system. 16 choices for each digit. It goes from 0 to 9, and the letters go from A to F. So out of those 16, one of those 16 characters or keystrokes, 0 to 9, A to F, can fill one of the 12 digits. If you have the hexadecimal address, that is a hardware feature of the computer you're using. So if you had this might be considered to be proof. Otherwise, you have an IP address, and the IP address can be faked. I mean, you can get proxies, you can get other things. So what we're left with is something uncertain. Now, there were two other features, though, of what Obama put forward, and we'll get to those now in our second hour here on World Crisis Radio New Year's Eve program 2016. Welcome to the second hour of World Crisis Radio. Once again, the last program of the old year. Best wishes for a happy new year to all of our friends and listeners and supporters. And if you want to do something to promote my work, to support this effort, then I suggest you go to americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv, become a subscriber. If you want to take it up to the $20 level there, you can be part of our activism. And that is the best way to support what I do. So I kindly request that you listen in, because it's worth it. It's about 50 cents a program. So 50 cents, you can't even buy a newspaper for 50 cents. And I think this is more informative and more rewarding, and maybe even more entertaining than a newspaper. Okay, so in addition to Grizzly Steppe, now Grizzly Steppe is supposedly the U.S. Justification for expelling 35 Russian diplomats and for closing 2 diplomatic compounds and for having in the offing a series of other measures which we don't know about yet. Russian President Putin has declined to expel any U.S. diplomats. I guess that's a plus. It's clever. It's a little bit out of the ordinary. So fine. That's good. It's not just the sort of Pavlovian autonomic reaction. It's not just a knee-jerk reaction. So good. Now, at the same time, we also have to say the reason that Grizzly Steppe and similar things might gain credibility is, again, it's not based on proof positive that these things were so, but it's based on the overwhelmingly anti-Hillary and pro-Trump line coming from the Russian media and the ones in the English language. And those media are outdoing themselves right now, trying to ridicule things like Grizzly Steppe and so forth. But certainly they're not proving their case much better than the U.S. In other words, they're simply saying, ha, ha, ha. They don't, and in many ways, they don't even deny it. They just ridicule the entire thing. So it's better to avoid large-scale expulsions. By the way, we have this little, the story coming from Moscow is that Lavrov, the foreign minister, wanted to expel 35 U.S. diplomats and close some U.S. compounds or offices or whatever else it was. But 35 expulsions, and then Putin said no. Now, I think that one is that might be a piece of dramaturgy, shall we say, right? That might be another theatrical moment to make this more interesting. Just in terms of the history of such things, let me remind you that back in 1971, we had the British, and this was the government of Ted Heath. Ted Heath, the liberal Tory, sort of centrist Tory, centrist conservative, and his foreign secretary, Sir Alec Douglas Hume, but written Home, H-O-M-E, Alec Douglas Home, Douglas Hume, as they want you to say it, expelled a total of 105 Russian diplomats from Britain. This was September 1971. A KGB major of the Soviets had defected to the British, and he said that there was a large-scale operation for sabotage going on, and that the Russian diplomats were involved. So 90 of the ones that were in Britain were kicked out, and 15 other Russian diplomats accredited in Britain who were traveling, they were told, you can't come back in, you all have to get out. So that was about 1/5 of the total diplomatic force that Russia had in Soviet Union had in Britain in 1971. Out of about 550, 105 were permanently PNG'd. They were declared, each one of them was persona non grata, and therefore they don't want you, then you're forced to go home. So these things do happen, and they don't always lead to the end of the world. So let's see what happens on the up to and around the 20th, right? Because whatever sanctions Obama puts in place can be immediately rolled back by the new administration. Now, while we're with the British, we ought to look at Theresa May. Now, this is an interesting story. We had this exchange between Netanyahu and Kerry, and in the other program, in AmericanSystem.tv, which I hope you'll subscribe to, I went through a description of what the peace package would actually have to look like, right? It's similar to the Yossi Beilin, Yasser Abed Rabo Geneva Accord, which was done by private groups, not governments, in 2003, in the autumn of that year. They put forward what I think is the internationally recognized standard of a Middle East peace solution, although you have to add the economic development part, the Marshall Plan, that they don't have quite as strong as it needs to be. So that's the background for this entire thing. So we had Kerry giving a detailed speech on U.S. Middle East policy, why the settlements are bad, why a two-state solution is the only way to go. I think that's fundamentally correct. Netanyahu responding with scorn. And again, here I think also dramaturgy, theatricality, histrionics, posturing are in play, because both Russia and Israel, interestingly enough, both of them are interested in underlining how much they don't like Obama and how they're hoping for something different under the new administration. But now here with Theresa May, this is interesting. Theresa May sends out her spokesperson, and this spokesperson doesn't seem to be named in any of these articles, criticizes Kerry quite with no ifs, ands, or buts. The spokesman of Theresa May says that the British government, quote, does not believe that it is appropriate to attack the composition of the democratically elected government of an ally. So this is after Kerry gave his speech. And Kerry had said, this is the most right-wing cabinet in Israeli history. You've got the Likud with a strong settler part, and you've also got this other political party, the Bayet Hayudi, the Jewish Home Party, which is, I think, largely or decisively influenced by the settlers. So the U.S. was not happy with this, and there are various things going on, right? One of them is that Theresa May wanted to be the first one to get a phone call from Trump at the moment that he won the election back in November, at the moment that he was declared the winner, and she didn't get it, right? CC beat her to the punch, and she was, 6th, 7th, or 8th in line, and she wanted to be number one. She's attempting to make a gesture to the new administration, but I think something else is going on also, and we'll be back in a minute here on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. Now, we want to stress again, there is proof here. This Grizzly Steppe is not proof, but there is this circumstantial case, which is based on things that have occurred in public and are unmistakable. I'm afraid that President Putin in his last press conference sounded very much like a partisan supporter of the Republican ticket and a critic of the existing U.S. administration. I also think it is unusual, to say the least, to say we're going to have an international conference on Syria in Astana, Kazakhstan, but Obama can't come. We're going to only allow people from the incoming administration. What is that? That's like saying the verdict of the American voter in the 2012 election is somehow invalid as declared by another country. I think this is not good form. I would also deplore the tweet put out by the Russian embassy in London, I guess it is, if this is genuine, and I really wonder if it is, where they essentially mock Obama, and they put a picture of a lame duck, or a duck, and it says lame, and that is supposed to be their way of dealing with Obama. Isn't that rather childish? Isn't that rather infantile? Is that really good diplomacy? I was very disappointed to see that. And if the shoe were on the other foot, I think they would see it differently. And remember, President Putin and the Russian government have said the only thing that counts is if the information is true. It doesn't matter how you got it. It can be illegally procured, but that doesn't matter. Is the information true? Is it true that Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Podesta were unfair to Bernie? Well, yeah, they probably were, but there's a bigger issue. There's an issue under the UN Charter of interfering in the internal affairs of a sovereign state. And, of course, the U.S. has violated this many times. But two wrongs or many wrongs do not make a right. And those of us here in the United States have, I think, an obligation to our own country to speak up, to protest that interference is not a good thing. And again, this is bearing in mind that the Grizzly Steppe does not constitute proof. And of course, none of this has much to do with the international context. And therefore, I would say I understand that the Astana conference might indeed take place before the 20th of January. What are we going to have? Prolong the Syrian war so that Obama won't be able to send a representative to Astana? People die every day. Why should they die? The war should be ended as soon as possible. And I would urge all concerned that the Astana conference should take place now, as soon as possible. You want to end wars, and that therefore this preclusion against Obama is in itself a kind of interference, which I don't think is going to sit well in the long term. After the 20th, of course, then it's a whole different story. Now, let's also, here's another thing. Right? If we want to talk about who supports terrorism and so forth, unbeknownst to most viewers of the U.S. media, there's this question now in Afghanistan, right? Afghanistan, of course, has fallen completely off the map. Here I'm reading a dispatch from Agence France Presse, dated December 29, 2016. Allegations of Russian and Iranian ties with Taliban stoke Afghan anxiety. And the story here is what we mentioned a couple of weeks ago. Allegations over Russia's and Iran's deepening ties with the Taliban have ignited concerns of a renewed great game of proxy warfare in Afghanistan that could undermine U.S.-backed troops and push the country deeper into turmoil. Moscow and Tehran insist their contact with insurgents is aimed at promoting regional security, but local U.S. and, in other words, Afghan and U.S. officials who are already frustrated with Pakistan's perceived double dealing in Afghanistan, Pakistan that is, have expressed bitter skepticism. So the complainer is usually General John Nicholson, U.S. commander in Afghanistan, and he says the Russian narrative is to claim that the Taliban are actually fighting the Islamic State, ISIS. But Nicholson says this is a malign influence. The political legitimacy that Russia lends to the Taliban is not based in fact, but is used as a way of essentially undermining the Afghan government and the NATO effort to bolster the belligerents. And he says Iran is similar. Now, I don't know, but we're told here that, according to an Afghan security official, loads of Russian-made weapons recently seized from areas on the border with Tajikistan are a particular concern for the Afghan government. So I would say all of this has to stop. We are opposed to delivering these man-pads, right? These sophisticated shoulder-fired missiles that are provided for these crazy Syrian rebels under the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. The money has not been appropriated, but it's been authorized. So there's another step. And then, of course, could decide not to do it. But the Russian Foreign Ministry said that was a hostile act. I agree. It should not be done. But then what about loads of Russian-made weapons being seized very near to the border of Afghanistan? Where are they headed? Is that a hostile act? Is that an unfriendly act? So I think we have to keep a broader vision and somehow not buy into narratives that may seem compelling but might not be accurate. So the request from the Afghan government is we ask Russia and Iran to work with Afghans to defeat terrorism, and I think that's fair enough. So there's a situation where some of the roles seem to be reversed compared to what they've been in the case of Syria. So bear that all in mind. Now, domestic policy. Now that we've handled Theresa May, or have we? No, we've still got to do justice to Theresa May. We'll be with her in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. We would also point out that the coverage on some of the Russian media makes a big deal about the fight between Kerry and Netanyahu and how the U.S. abstained on the resolution. And, of course, Russia voted in favor of the resolution, but somehow that does not appear in the narrative, and they should be proud of it because it was a correct resolution. It's just I think we can see that propaganda is playing a role now. Theresa May criticizing the U.S. So on the one hand, the British papers say she wants to make a friendly gesture to the new Republican administration. I would also say this is perfide Albion once again Theresa May looks like she's trying to say, well, if you don't want to have to deal with the U.S., right? You can't trust them, so why don't you gravitate towards London? And of course, that was the colonial power, right? That was the mandatory power of the mandate, the League of Nations mandate of Palestine, that got us into this mess under the Sykes-Picot agreement and all the rest of those things after World War I and then after World War II. So remember, we're dealing with the Sino-British bloc behind the scenes. Not a lot, perhaps, coming to the surface, but we'll be digging below the surface as the weeks and months go on. So the irony here is that the British government, once again, voted for the anti-settlement resolution. The spokesman says the British government believes that the construction of settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory is illegal, which is why we supported UN Security Council Resolution 2334 last week. But, says the May spokesman, we are also clear that the settlements are far from the only problem in the conflict. In particular, the people of Israel deserve to live free from the threat of terrorism with which they have had to cope for too long. And of course, this is all fine. And then she says, the spokesperson says, you shouldn't be criticizing the fact that the Netanyahu government is what it is. I don't see that as a taboo. Now, the State Department, surprisingly, showed some signs of life. And a spokesperson here at the U.S. State Department in Foggy Bottom, quote, we are surprised by the U.K. Prime Minister's office statement that Secretary Kerry's remarks, which covered the full range of threats to a two-state solution, including terrorism, violence, incitement, and settlements, were in line with the United Kingdom's own long-standing policy and its vote at the UN. Remember, U.S. has abstained, but the British voted for it, and the Russians, and the French, and the Chinese. The State Department goes on, we are grateful for the strongly supportive statements in response to Kerry's speech that have come in from around the world, including Germany, right? This is Steinmeier on his way to becoming president of Germany, France, Canada, Jordan, Egypt, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and others, says the State Department. So a little bit of a tiff there. We may be seeing the twilight of some of these alliances. We'll be getting into that. I think quite a number of them deserve to survive. You can see that Abe of Japan wants to keep his alliance. I think Merkel does too. But with this British-Chinese bloc, that is a question mark. Anyway, a couple of things on the domestic front. Now, no matter what happens, it's metaphysically impossible for the Congress to stay in session continuously from now into next week. Probably on the 3rd of January, there's going to be an infinitesimal microsecond where the atomic clocks can notice it. And that will be a time when, beyond any doubt, the Congress is out of session. So here I find a highly interesting article from the New Republic, David Dayen, D-A-Y-E-N. Obama can and should put Merrick Garland on the Supreme Court. The outgoing president has one card to play. He should play it. Come January, Obama will be consigned to the sidelines as Trump occupies the Oval Office and begins perhaps dismantling Obama's legacy, as is widely said. But there is one action that Obama could take on January 3rd, 2017, that could hold off some of the worst potential abuses of the Republican domination for up to a year. Obama can appoint his nominee Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court on that date in between the two sessions of Congress. Now, unfortunately, a note of realism, based on everything we know about Obama's temperament and politics, he won't do it. And indeed, he could have and should have done it. As soon as Scalia died, he could have surprised everybody with a recess appointment. He failed to do so. But given how Republicans relentlessly obstructed his efforts for 8 years, he would be completely justified in playing this final card. There's a cost to ignoring this possibility. The fact that the Democrats prefer to maintain the norms and traditions of governance, even while Republicans break them time and time again, inescapably pushes the policy-making apparatus of this country to the right. And remember, if you're a conservative, you should be interested in precedent, tradition, custom, and a lot of things that are just going by the board. So we know in the Constitution we have the recess appointment. We've had recent cases. Even the most conservative, reactionary members of the Supreme Court, I would say, acknowledge that a president can make recess appointments during the intersession, the break between the first and second year of a Congress, or the break between the outgoing and incoming Congress. So the New Republic urges Obama to do it. Now, this is something like what we had back in the time the Republicans were threatening to bankrupt the government with default. And it was discovered in the 14th Amendment, right? The public debt of the United States should not be questioned. And a lot of Democrats told Obama, you should declare that if the money runs out, you're going to tell the Secretary of the Treasury to keep paying because that's the 14th Amendment. And Obama didn't do it. This is unfortunately a litany of lost opportunities. The Washington Post of a day or two ago gets its 2 cents in, saying that this would be a futile gesture, that it wouldn't go anywhere. The one argument that they have is that if you nominate Merrick Garland and if you take him out of the United States Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, then you will have created a vacancy there that is not a good thing at the present time. So the answer to that is don't name Merrick Garland. Merrick Garland was tailored to try to be so moderate and so acceptable and so respectable that all the Republicans would have a hard time saying no to him. But you see, they don't care. They don't care about his qualifications or his moderation or his centrism or anything like that. They don't care. So you wouldn't have to name Merrick Garland. Obama could name anybody he wants, could and should name anybody he wants in that microsecond on January 3rd. So we'll soon find out. Don't hold your breath. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, getting to the last segment of our New Year's program. Remember to hear from yours truly every day of the week, Monday through Thursday at least. Please go to americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv, and subscribe. Join a growing audience because it is growing. It is thriving. We just completed the 99th broadcast since we switched to radio in the middle of August. So please support that effort. Now we come to the end of the year. We've been talking on the other broadcast especially about nihilism. And by the way, let me urge you, one good reason to subscribe to the American System. We're going to be doing a major unit on China this coming week. In the first week of the new year, we're going to talk about what's happening with China and why this is even an additional complication to the world picture, because of the complex interplay of the internal politics of China and the troubles of President Xi and perhaps the shortcomings, the failures of President Xi, and how there's a tendency now to export that into the rest of the world in the form of crisis. Right? We just had the Chinese aircraft carrier going around the southern edge of Taiwan, right? Kaohsiung, big port, Chinese aircraft carrier goes by, And this is a problem. We've also got the president of Taiwan from the DPP, Democratic Progressive Party, I guess it is, coming to the United States, and Beijing is saying you're not allowed to let her into the United States. This is, I think, absurd. So back in 1989, Francis Fukuyama came out with his essay on the end of history, and he later expanded that into a book, 1992 book on the end of history. And his absurd thesis was that the main questions of human existence had been answered by the Anglo-American system of what he called democracy. And, of course, this has now been revealed, at least to many, as being oligarchy, that the Anglo-American system is fundamentally not democratic, but it's oligarchical. It's the 1% or less. It's a government of billionaires and a plutocracy, and it's not democratic. And it is the continuation of the British oligarchical system, the Whig Party, as Benjamin Disraeli would have called it, the Venetian Party, as Disraeli also called it. So this entire model, in particular the U.S. version of this model, is now in a crisis, and its legitimation is up in the air. But still, I think the underlying problem is that the United States has lost 2/3 of the standard of living that was prevalent in the late 1960s or around 1970, early 1970s. It's minus 1/2, minus 2/3. And this is the big question now in terms of the election surprises of 2016. Now, the problem with that is that there is no other model which currently exists that would be the solution to the world problem. In other words, capable of leading the world out of the crisis, right? It used to be you had the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union had communism, they had Marxism, they had Marxism-Leninism, they had the dictatorship of the proletariat. This claimed to be real socialism with the working class in power. And, of course, the Soviet Union is no more, and that whole ideology has been largely swept away. And what you now seem to have is a kind of dualism where you have the group around Putin, which exercises the power of the government, of the police, of the army, the power ministries as they're described. But then you have a collection of oligarchs who sprang up in the 1990s, but have now continued with certain personnel changes. They're still there, who run a great deal of the economy. So it's a kind of a bifurcated system. You've got Putin and the government, but then you've got the oligarchs who really do have a lot to say about what goes on in the economy. Many aspects of the Russian system are not sufficiently known in the West. I think there's a whole story to be told about the healthcare system in Russia, which has, I think, developed serious shortcomings. It's underfunded, just like the U.S., but perhaps more than the U.S. So you're now left with the mockery of Fukuyama, that it's not the end of history, right? That the entire ideological world of the Anglo-Americans and the English-speaking people, this is all in crisis. And then in Russia, instead of having an aggressive model that says we can solve it, right, give us a chance, follow what we're doing, and holding that out to developing countries, they don't have it. So this is the two-sided vacuum, if I can mix metaphors. The two-sided vacuum is that both of these models are found to be unsatisfactory. And again, I would stress on the Western side, it is finance capital that has failed. Finance capital is a failure. Russia, oligarchy, cannot work. It will not work. It is not capable of solving the problems. But the Western finance oligarchy is what we have to deal with here directly, and this also cannot work. Now, I would recommend the answer to this is what we call the American system. In other words, you can call it the American system. You can also call it the German system, because these are practically identical. The person involved here is Friedrich List, the great opponent of British free trade, great ideologist of protectionism, dirigism, the guy who created the customs union, the Zollverein in Central Europe, that eventually led to the emergence of Germany as a single country, at least most of it, on the German side. And we've been talking about this, right? It is, once again, dirigism, protectionism, mercantilism, cameralism, sometimes called, especially in 18th or 19th century texts. In other words, world economic development and cooperation for that. And you can apply this to things as they emerge. In other words, what's the real thing missing from the Middle East peace process? It is a Marshall Plan for the Middle East that would attract countries to join it. In other words, as long as it's just, do you support a two-state solution as a matter of theory or of politics, a lot of people are going to say no. And as you say, if you get a two-state solution, then there's going to be a Marshall Plan.